The Chancellor doesn't want to cut spending and she doesn't want to raise your taxes. But the government can't have it all on Wednesday when the budget finally arrives. As the huge day approaches this morning, we'll hear your hopes and fears.
What I'd like to see in the budget is the abolishment of triple lock and means testing for the state pension.
One thing I really want to see in the budget is a rise in railway subsidies.
Please don't say that nothing can be done. Please don't say that it has to be business as usual.
Well, we know there's cash for transport because the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, is with us live this morning, alongside the Conservatives' money man, Mel Stride, and the leader of the Greens, Zack Polanksi. And the extraordinary true story of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is about to be brought to life on TV. We'll hear from her husband and the actor who plays him, award-winning Joseph Fiennes.
Honestly, I found it when I first read the screenplay. As a father of two children, I responded viscerally to the emotion of the story of Richard and Nazanin's plight here.
Morning. And our team at the desk for the next hour this week, the leader of Unite, one of the UK's biggest unions, Sharon Graham, the former Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and the Bank of England's former Chief Economist, Andy Haldane. Welcome to all three of you. Let's start with what we always do, what's making the news. The Sunday Times splashes on a badly kept budget secret. Rachel Reeves looks set to remove the limit on big families claiming some benefits, known as the two-child cap. The Sunday Mirror has a promise from Rachel Reeves saying the government will help ease the cost of living. Zack Polanski's been speaking to The Observer too, and the paper leads with that interview and his claim he'd never trust Keir Starmer. We'll speak to him later. The Sunday Telegraph takes on the proposed plan for peace in Ukraine being discussed in Geneva today. But The Sun and the Mail on Sunday both splash on the Prime Minister's comments that, just like anyone, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor should answer questions on Jeffrey Epstein if he has evidence to share. So let's get to the main business of the day, then the budget. You all in various ways are hugely familiar with what is going on and how these things are put together. So I just wonder for both of you, what is your absolute top of the list thing that you would want Rachel Reeves to achieve this week?
Well, look, I think what Rachel needs to do this week is be Labour. They are a Labour government. Go in and put a budget in that is actually Labour. They need to do a wealth tax because everyday people cannot pay any more. They need to go to the wealthiest in our society, and they also need to change the fiscal rules so that we can borrow to invest. They need to be Labour. OK. The implication, of course, there being that they haven't been Labour enough for you so far. Andy Haldane, Labour's already changed the rules around spending and borrowing. So what would you want to see this week?
Well, we've had, month upon month of speculation, fiscal fandango, basically. And we need, and that's been costly for the economy. It's caused paralysis among businesses and consumers.
So that's a real-world consequence of the political whirligig that's been going on.
It's the single biggest reason why growth has flatlined and has been grounded in the second half of the year. So next week, we need a decisive action that puts to bed and beyond reproach any notion of further tax rises, I would say. And actually accompanying that, a re-engineering of the budgetary process. Too lengthy, too leaky, with real costs. So let's fix, for the foreseeable future, the possibility of tax rises and fix the budget process.
That's interesting. So the process itself has been damaging here. You've said that fiscal fandango. Jeremy Hunt, you were the Chancellor for the Conservatives. You did lots of different jobs in government, so you know what it feels like the Sunday before a budget. If you were Rachel Reeves, what would you do?
Well, first of all, politics aside, I completely understand the pressure that Rachel Reeves is under. It is really, really tough. But there is a big choice that she is making, which we should be talking about more, which is between welfare reform and tax rises. If she got the welfare bill down to the level it was just before the pandemic, so not too far back, there wouldn't need to be any tax rises at all, and she'd have a lot more headroom in her budget. Instead, I fear, when we hear about the two-child cap this morning, that she's going the opposite direction. We're going to be spending more on welfare. And the great risk of putting up taxes is that you slow down economic growth even more, and we end up coming back with an even more difficult budget in a year's time, and that's my big worry.
OK.
But I think the thing, Laura, is that what people are going to look at this morning is who pays. Who pays. So for too long, it's been workers and communities that have paid. This budget has got to show whose side Labour is on, and they are not going back to workers and communities to pay again. That is absolutely critical. If they don't do that, then people will move away from Labour. There's no doubt about that. That's what I'm hearing. Who pays is the question that needs to be answered.
OK, all three of you. It's great to have you with us on such a big day. So thanks for your insights so far. Forget all the froth, ignore all the noise, and there has been a lot of it. The fiscal fandango, as Andy Haldane described it. We know the government doesn't want to cut spending or stick more on the mythical credit card or ask most of you to pay much more tax. But the Chancellor is hemmed in by the economic reality that there isn't much to go round and the political truth that her party is often greedy for more spending. And the restless, unhappy public, well, many are eager to see more bang for their buck. In the last couple of weeks, we've been asking you to let us know what you would like the government to do.
Hi there, my name's Linda and I'm the owner here at the Kitchen Croxley.
My name's Bo. I commute from Berkshire to London every day.
I'm James, and I'm a scientist living in Manchester.
I'm Keith Hunter of Minehead in Somerset, owner of a sustainable living business.
My name is Ellen Green. I am a master's student studying in London and living at home with my parents.
Within the hospitality sector, we're really struggling with the rate of VAT at 20%. Also, the increase in the employer's national insurance contributions has hit us hard.
What I'd like to see in the budget is the abolishment of triple lock and means testing for the state pension, so the payments only go to people who really need that support.
One thing I really want to see in the budget is a rise in railway subsidies.
I would like to see more help given to small businesses who'd like to employ staff but put off by all the extra costs on top of paying a living wage. We're not opposed to an income tax rise, just as long as we can see it's being spent properly.
One thing that I want to see in the up-and-coming budget is for first-time buyer stamp duty to stay at £425,000.
One thing I don't want to see in the budget are any new taxes on electric vehicles.
What I don't want to see is an increase in VAT or fuel duty.
One thing that I do not want to see are any cuts to disability allowances.
Please don't say that nothing can be done. Please don't say that it has to be business as usual, because if that's all that comes out of the budget, then for many of us, there will be no business as usual.
Well, let's talk then to Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary, who's here for the government this morning. Welcome. I just want to start, first of all, with all of the chatter around the budget that's been going on for many months. Andy Haldane, who's a very well-known and respected economist, has said the fiscal fandango has damaged the economy in the last few months. Do you accept that?
Well, what I think we have done as a government is set out what our priorities for this budget are, which is about cutting the cost of living for people. We're making an announcement today about freezing rail fares for the first time in 30 years. We want to cut NHS waiting lists and we want to cut the national debt. And so I think the fact that the Chancellor has been open and honest about the considerations that are at play in this process is important for the electorate. She needs to explain what is happening. The review that the OBR have done about the productivity forecasts has meant that this whole process has really taken place on shifting sands to start off with, and we've got a very challenging global economic environment.
But there's one thing saying to people in advance, look, it's going to be tough and we need you to understand that. It's quite another thing having, by one senior MP's count, 13 different tax raises floated, all sorts of measures put out there and discussed in the public domain. So again, do you accept, as Andy Haldane does, that all this months of speculation and guessing games has actually materially damaged the economy? That's what he's just told us.
People always speculate in advance of a budget, Laura, and we have always said, wait until the budget on the 26th of November. The Chancellor
Well, you haven't. The Chancellor's been out there giving speeches. You haven't said wait and see. You're here with an announcement today.
Well, I think the government would have been damned if we do, damned if we don't. If the Chancellor hadn't made that speech, you would have been saying, where is the Chancellor? And so the fact that she has made clear her priorities about cutting the cost of living for people, we know that those pressures are still really acute for families across the country, cutting NHS waiting lists and cutting the national debt, as well as being clear about what her commitments are around fiscal stability, strong fiscal rules, making sure that we are getting national debt down so that we can invest more in public services, spend more of taxpayers' money on investing in schools, the NHS, roads, energy infrastructure, because at the moment we're spending £1 in every 10 on servicing the national debt. So we need to get the national debt down so we can invest in public services.
OK, well, some of the investments that you're making are, lucky for your department, in your department. You mentioned the rail fare freeze already, and one of our viewers, Bo, said he'd like to see more subsidy into rail. You are freezing fares, regulated fares, so about half of them in England, but it only covers half the kind of tickets that people get. Can you guarantee that other fares won't go up to compensate?
So this is the first time in 30 years that any government has frozen fares. In the last decade and a half, rail fares have gone up by 60%, and both the Chancellor and I are acutely aware of how important affordability is to the travelling public. That's why we're stepping in to make sure that hard-working families and commuters can keep more of their hard-earned cash. Regulated fares means that over 1 billion journeys next year will benefit from this freeze. It's really significant. If you're commuting on a flexi season ticket from Milton Keynes into London for 3 days a week, that's a saving of over £300 compared to if fares had gone up by the amount that they went up last year, which was RPI +1, because fares have historically tracked against inflation. This is going to make a real difference to people.
And lots of people watching might think, hooray, it's going to be cheaper for me to get to work than it otherwise might have been. But the question here is, who's going to pay for that? So are other ticket prices going to go up to compensate? Or indeed, are train operators and the government actually going to have less to spend on repairing creaky old lines, buying new trains, the kinds of updates that so much of our transport network desperately needs?
No, this is a fully funded policy, and the Chancellor will be setting out more information at the budget. Regulated fares have tended to inform the price of unregulated fares. They track against each other normally. And so the capital investments that we're making in the rail network, be that investment in HS2 to complete the line between London and Birmingham, the Transpennine route upgrade to improve capacity and connectivity between some of the great cities of the north of England, or even building that new railway between Oxford and Cambridge. That's protected because we recognise that investing in the infrastructure of this country is the right long-term decision. And I think this is what lies underneath what the Chancellor is trying to achieve here. She will take the necessary and fair decisions in the long-term interests of this country. We saw what happened under Liz Truss and the previous Conservative government when they cut capital spending. And Jeremy's sat, on your panel today, and he will know that Liz Truss, when she was Prime Minister, it was a ridiculous spectacle of her complaining about a hospital where the roof was falling in and the hospital was on stilts. And that is a consequence of the short-term decisions of cutting capital investment.
And this is your
we're not going to be doing that.
And Labour's been in charge now for nearly 18 months, and this is Rachel Reeves' second budget, and the economy has not been pretty since you have been in charge. But one of the other things you want to do is around electric cars. Have you bought your electric car yet? We asked you last time you were here.
I haven't, and I think last time I spoke to you, Laura, I said I'm not in the habit of buying a new car every couple of years, and I think that's the experience of the majority of people across the country. Buying a new car is a big investment. When I do purchase a new car, the next car I buy will be an electric vehicle.
So you're going to subsidise, with nearly £2 billion, people who might be thinking about buying an electric car. But this is an expansion of what you announced in the summer. And the evidence so far doesn't really suggest that it's made that much difference. In fact, the numbers of people who bought an electric car, I think in September, once the scheme was up and running, is basically the same as it was the month before. So why are you putting taxpayers' money towards relatively well-off people who might be able to buy a new car in any case?
So let's be clear, purchases of electric vehicles are at a record high. Since we launched
the scheme,
it is on an upward trajectory, and we have the highest volume of sales of electric vehicles as a result, I think, of the introduction of the electric car grant. The electric car grant gives people who are buying a new electric car up to £3,750 off a new vehicle. There are 39 models that are eligible for that grant, and since we launched it a couple of months ago, 35,000 people have availed themselves of this grant. This is an investment in the country's future. We see the transition to electric vehicles and the good quality manufacturing jobs that are associated with that. For example, the Nissan Leaf, which is produced at Sunderland, thousands of jobs dependent upon that. That's just qualified for the electric car grant. And so making sure that we are enabling people to buy a new electric vehicle if that's what they want to do, whilst also investing in charging infrastructure.
But we're also...
It is the right term, it is the right long-term decision for the country.
But unless you want to rule it out right now, which is your choice to do, we're also expecting the Chancellor to make it more expensive to drive an electric car with some sort of pay per mile scheme. So if you pardon the pun, you're trying to get people to make it cheaper to buy them, but make it more expensive to drive them, which is putting the foot on the brake and the accelerator at the same time. That doesn't make sense, does it?
So I'm not going to preempt the budget. I know that the Chancellor will be on your show next week and can answer questions about the announcement that she's going to make. As we make the transition to electric vehicles, I think two things can be true at the same time. We need a fair vehicle taxation system for all motorists, because EVs, like drivers of petrol and diesel cars, they're driving on roads that require maintenance. We've got ageing infrastructure, motorways that were built back in the 60s and 70s. And so we need to have a fair taxation system that is future focused. But we're not going to do anything to jeopardise the transition to electric vehicles, and that will remain front and centre.
But it is a problem that this government sometimes has, is that you give a mixed message. So whether electric cars will be both cheaper and more expensive, Rachel Reeves says that she's determined to try and control welfare spending, but it looks like the two-child benefit cap is going to be removed. I mean, will you be pleased if that happens and those limits on benefits for people with bigger families disappears?
So I think tackling child poverty is in the DNA of the Labour Party. Nobody wants to see kids going without. And we know that children who are growing up in poverty have a lifetime of consequences associated with that. Less likely to do well at school, more likely as a young adult not to be in employment or in training. We also know that 3/4 of children who are growing up in poverty in this country are in households where mum and dad are working. And so, look, Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, has done a brilliant job in leading the Child Poverty Task Force, and I'm confident that across the piece we will be making decisions which mean that at the end of this Parliament there are fewer children living in poverty than there were at the start of it.
So the cap's going to go?
So I'm not going to get ahead of the budget, Laura, but what I would say is that one of the defining elements of this government for me is about what we can do to ensure that children's chances in life aren't determined by the size of their parents' bank balance. And I think most people across the country would not want children to be growing up in acute poverty. And I think in order for them to be able to do well at school, get on, have good careers, we need to make sure that we're taking decisions across the piece. We've already been doing that, for example, with putting up the minimum wage for the lowest earners in the country. We've introduced free breakfast clubs, expanded funded childcare.
That a lot. And forgive me, we are short of time, but it sounds to me, I know you don't want to confirm it, but you are making the argument there about why it would be a good Labour thing to do to take away the two-child benefit cap. I must just briefly ask you about the negotiations in Geneva today, a couple of days after President Trump put forward this peace plan for Ukraine, which would involve them making some pretty significant concessions. Should Ukraine consider concessions? What's the UK's message in Geneva today?
So the Prime Minister spoke to President Zelensky yesterday, also spoke to President Trump and other global leaders in the margins of the G20 summit in Johannesburg. We do support President Trump in his push for peace, and we think that there are some elements of his plan that are essential for a lasting peace, but it does require some additional work. There's a meeting in Geneva today which is going to be critical of national security advisors, the Americans, the Ukrainians. Our guiding principle is that the only people that can determine the future of Ukraine is the Ukrainians themselves, and we will stand alongside them to try and bring this appalling conflict to an end.
Okay, Heidi Alexander, thank you very much indeed for coming in to see us today. A busy day, so thank you very much. And of course, here at the BBC, we'll be reporting on the progress of those talks in Geneva. As ever, we want to know what you think. Thank you for sharing some of your ideas about what you'd like to see in the budget or what you wouldn't like to see. Do keep getting in touch. You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or on social media. If you're that way inclined, you can use BBC Laura K as the hashtag. And the WhatsApp number's there, 08000 282 161. Now then, grumpiness with the economy is one of, not the only, but one of the big reasons why Labour has been struggling to keep up. And the Green Party has been gobbling up support under its new leader in England and Wales, Zack Polanski, who's with us this morning. Welcome to you. Good to have you with us in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
We just heard Heidi Alexander there strongly hinting that the limit on benefits for bigger families, known as the two-child benefit cap, is going to go. If that is swept away, is that a victory for the left? Maybe including you?
Absolutely. It's something we've been calling for a long time. 1 in 3 children are living in poverty, and this would lift 300,000 children out of poverty almost immediately. It's absolutely outrageous it's taken the Labour government so long to do it. But if they do it, that'll be a victory and they'll celebrate it. More widely, though, we know that this Chancellor will keep talking about tough choices. But they always seem to be tough choices for people out of work or working people who are working really hard while their wages aren't going up, but food prices are going up, for disabled people. When are we going to see tough choices for multimillionaires and billionaires? It's time to tax the rich.
Well, let's then look at what's actually happened in terms of taxes. You want to increase taxes on wealth, but this is what's happened to income tax actually over the last few decades. So in the last 20 years, actually, and the lines are a bit wobbly, but what it shows us is actually people at the top 10%, their share of income tax paid has gone up about 10%, and it's actually gone down a little bit for middle and bottom earners. So just before we get into this debate, the fact is the Conservatives and then the Labour government have, broadly speaking, taxed the rich more and taxed other earners less.
So this is about inequality. For decades now, poor people have got poorer and rich people have got richer. It's important when I talk about millionaires and billionaires. If you go back, say, a million minutes, you get back to the beginning of 2023. Most people can probably remember what they were doing at the beginning of 2023. If you go back a billion minutes, you get to the Roman Empire. That's the difference in inequality in this country. So I'm talking about multimillionaires and billionaires paying their fair share. Now, it's important to say, people will say, does that raise enough? Is it just about raising revenue? That's not actually the point. Of course, the money is important. Well, the real point is about tackling inequality.
So the point then for you of putting up tax on the very wealthy is to try to stop them being as wealthy. It's not actually to raise money for schools and hospitals and public services.
We can raise that money anyway. What it's about is the fact that if you have that much money, if you're a billionaire, you can't spend it quickly, even if you try. So you hoard it in assets. And it's the assets that are the problem here, because that's exacerbating the inequality that already exists. But what we need to do is get that money and those assets flowing around the economy.
But how do you raise that money anyway if it's not through taxation?
Well, there's a few ways. So Sharon was exactly right earlier when she's talking about borrowing to invest. That's one way. But also there's something called spending multipliers, which is where you invest in the economy, say the National Health Service. You get that money back because you have a well population. Now, of course, it's important that people are healthy just to be healthy. But actually, if you cut through austerity, that's a completely false economy. You have people missing work, you have more long-term health conditions, and you break the economy in the way that we've seen both Conservative governments do it and Labour government now too.
But you say there you can borrow. The government's already borrowing enormous amounts, and there is an already massive amount of national debt. And it's way more than the government spends every year, and it costs a fortune to pay the interest on that debt. So would you not put any limits on government borrowing?
Well, the first thing to say is debt to GDP ratio is at 100%. In Japan, it's 270%, and they have much better living standards than we do.
But in terms of this country, it's at the highest level it's been for a very, very long time. The financial markets are very sensitive to the decisions that the Chancellor makes. That's the case whether you'd like it or not. The UK's already got huge levels of debt. So are you suggesting that actually you'd be relaxed about the government borrowing much, much more?
Well, I think Andy Burnham was really interesting recently when he said we need to stop being in hock to the bond markets. And I think
there was a market reaction.
Well, exactly. So what I think we need to do is get back to a place where actually democratic politicians who are elected by the people are more worried about the cleaners, the teachers, the nurses, the people on the ground who are actually creating the economy with their hands rather than the people who hold these assets, who are making money while they sleep without actually working. That's deeply problematic. Now, are the markets important? Of course, they play a role, but much more important is the trust of the public on the politicians that they democratically elect. And we've gone so far the other way.
But the public didn't trust the government very much when Liz Truss completely freaked out the financial markets by promising billions of unfunded tax cuts. Again, you might not like it.
Well, Liz Truss was an absolute disaster.
But the real world that we're in right now, and you might want a completely different shape of economy, I think you do.
Yes, absolutely.
But the real world that we live in is that this country owes trillions of pounds to the financial markets, and therefore decisions that politicians take, don't they have to take them into account? You can't wish away the overdraft.
So I'm definitely not going to defend Liz Truss. I don't think anyone should. But actually, you said it really well. She was borrowing for unfunded tax cuts. What I'm talking about is borrowing for capital, infrastructure and investment that essentially creates spending multipliers that comes back into the economy. Second, though, in terms of the borrowing, a lot of that borrowing is from the Bank of England. That's money we owe to ourselves. It's not borrowing or debt in any real sense. Also, it's a lot of foreign countries who want to have that debt because actually that's a good investment for them because we have a relatively stable currency.
But before we get into, we could go down a really esoteric debate about economics.
It is important though, because
it is important.
Can I say one other thing on that though, on the esotericism?
Well, I want to ask you.
A household economy is nothing like a national budget, and we really need to break that metaphor.
And of course, it is not the same thing. But people look at the government in terms of what they borrow and what they spend and how they raise money through our taxation.
But we need to break that metaphor because it's a completely different way of looking at the economy, which is really important.
I just want to get a specific answer to that question, though. Do you believe there ought to be any limit on the amount that the government borrows? Would you say? Yes,
absolutely.
And where would you set it?
It depends on how many resources you have in the economy and also people who are able to use that resources. So you have to watch inflation, but that's not about how much you borrow. That's about the physical resources in a space. Once that's run out, then you're in a problem. But we're in a problem anyway because we face a climate crisis and an ecological emergency. And so we have literal physical barriers to the amount that we should be producing.
OK. We know that you are no fan of the defence alliance, NATO. You talked about that last time you were here, and you argue for peace wherever possible instead. Should Ukraine consider making concessions to bring an end to a terrible conflict?
Well, that's ultimately up to the Ukrainians and Zelensky. I think it's important our country stands in solidarity with the Ukrainians and also says that they should have a negotiated settlement and a sustained settlement. I think it's deeply problematic that Donald Trump seems to be bulldozing this whole settlement in the same way that he tried to in Gaza and Palestine. I think ultimately we need to make sure that we have people who are talking about peace and diplomacy at the table. And just on NATO, I've been very clear that I want an alternative alliance based on working with our European neighbours. I think Brexit was a disaster for this country, both economically, but also for our security in terms of it being outsourced to Donald Trump.
And things have been going pretty well for you since you took over as leader, and you've suggested that you'll stand as an MP in London. One poll showed that you could actually take the Holborn and St Pancras seat, which just happens to be the Prime Minister's constituency. Do you fancy taking him on for the next general election?
It'd be very tempting to take Keir Starmer down. But actually what I'm doing right now is really focusing on right across England and Wales, growing the Green Party. We've just hit 175,000 members.
But you are tempted to take him on, that's what you said.
I mean, I'm tempted to take on any Labour MP that's a disaster and ultimately replace them with a better MP who will stand for people and planet rather than vested interests.
OK, Zack Polanski, leader of the Green Party in England and
Wales.
Much. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us today. Well, there is a lot to digest. It is a huge few days for all of our politicians as the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, puts the finishing touches to her budget, no doubt locked in the Treasury today, looking through the numbers. That was a very, very interesting 20 minutes or so. Andy, what did you make, first of all, of... Let's talk about Heidi Alexander, first of all, because then I'd be very interested to hear what you thought of Zack Polanski's economic worldview. What did you think of what Heidi had to say about your fiscal fandango?
Well, some good news there in terms of rail fares, and that will cut some slack to lots of consumers on their travel bills. That's a good thing. I didn't hear much of a response on how best we avoid the pantomime of this year. Bear in mind, this is not the first pantomime we've had. There was one last year, indeed, under previous governments as well. This budgetary process has been degraded over many years and needs tightening up.
Jeremy, what did you make of what Heidi had to say?
Well, looking at the substance of it, I am very worried about the fact that we're going to be spending £3 to £4 billion on the abolition of the two-child cap. I know Sharon will disagree with me on this, but You know, the Institute for Fiscal Studies did a very detailed piece of work in which they said that this cap has made no difference at all to the life chances of the poorest children. And you can measure child poverty mechanistically and make an argument that this will reduce it. But if you look at the root causes, the root cause of poverty for many children is parents who are not in work, and this is going to lead to more parents not in work.
But some economists take a very different view, and a lot of people say actually the one biggest thing you could do to get kids out of poverty, and most families who claim benefits are in households where people are at work, and the problem is that they're not earning enough to be able to put food on the table and look after their kids.
I think the evidence is very clear. The number of children in absolute poverty, despite austerity, widely criticised, actually went down under the last government. And the reason is because the number of workless households, kids growing up in a family where no one's working, went down by 1 million in the first decade of that government. So, you know, it's going to put up the bill for taxpayers. I think it'll get more children actually ultimately in poverty as a result. And I thought that was a sign, I'm afraid, that the government is weak and not able to persuade its own backbenchers of the things that both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer in their heart know is the right thing to do, but they're not able to do it.
Sharon, there was an elegantly raised eyebrow right there.
I don't think it's a surprise of the century that I'm disagreeing wholeheartedly with Jeremy there. But look, I think actually when Heidi was talking and she said the phrase necessary and fair decisions. Now, to me, what that really means is that we are going to be looking at a number of people still paying. And I cannot understand that when we're saying we've got a black hole of £30 billion, that's the latest figure, you've had everyday people paying for the 2008 financial crash in austerity years, paid for COVID with their lives, some of them, workers out there paying again. Why can't we just simply say we tax the richest 1% more, that gives you £25 billion in a one-off payment, that almost takes that black hole out. And I cannot understand why that can't happen. And just one thing, on the borrow to invest, I'm working with workers and industry every single day. If we don't start getting some backing to UK PLC, we are losing jobs hand over fist because we're not creating the industries to replace the industries that are going. And unless we do that, we're going to be in a worse position because you won't have the taxation that you need in terms of doing the things they're talking about. I cannot understand why this computer says no constant response comes from government ministers. This is a Labour government. Do what Labour governments do.
Andy, is it just then something that the government should consider, as Sharon would have it, just tax the 1% much more than they already do and raise 20 billion quid? Why not just do that?
Well, I think there's the scope for doing something further on that front, particularly around housing. But of course, most of that wealth is really quite mobile. Already the top 1% of earners pay a third of all the tax revenues. And much of that wealth is mobile. And much of the rest of the world is rolling out the red carpet to attract those people right now. So I'd be cautious about taxing all wealth. The housing bit is worth thinking about doing more.
So where there's been lots of speculation is that Rachel Reeves is looking at some form of sort of mansion tax. But just on that mobility, you often see stories in different... Let me just put this point to Andy. There is a lot of reporting and suggestion, and particularly from people on the right, that people who have wealth in this country are actually upping sticks already. As one of the country's foremost economists, you don't have your own economy, is that true? Is there concrete evidence of that? Or is it just anecdote?
I mean, the truth is we don't have the data to know for sure. The anecdote is certainly there, and there is some evidence of that. The precise scale remains an open question, I would say. But what I would say, in addition, I agree with Sharon and with Zack that more needs to be done to support government investment, the wellspring of growth. But I also agree with Jeremy in saying that financial markets do need to see some sign that this government is capable of getting its arms around public spending. It really does. This is a vulnerable moment. There's a risk of a Wile E. Coyote moment for this government, that the ground disappears from beneath their feet in financial markets, and that is to be avoided at all cost, because the cost will be felt.
But one thing I'd say, I think it's important, is that, you know, why is it a better choice to pit pensioners against the disabled? Why is that a better choice than taxing some of the richest in our society? We've moved from 15 billionaires to 156 billionaires since the 1990s.
This is why what Zack Polanski was saying is is economically totally illiterate, because the job of a chancellor is not just to reduce the gap between rich and poor, and I think everyone here supports a progressive tax system, but it's also to raise money for public services like the NHS. Now, in today's news, we hear that Lakshmi Mittal, who's one of those billionaires, is leaving the country. And I heard Zack Polanksi say earlier this week, if millionaires don't want to pay their tax here, good riddance. Well, that is less money to Rachel Reeves to pay for doctors, nurses, schools. That is a bad thing. And one of the things the Chancellor has to do is not just redistribute tax revenues, but actually make sure we have enough money to pay for our vital public services. And if we don't do that, we're going to end up with cuts.
But you can't base that on just what one person saying they're going to leave the country. Other countries have wealth tax. Other countries have wealth tax. Switzerland has one, quite frankly, and they've got a lot of wealthy people the last time I looked. The problem is that we're never willing to look at a different way. People out there are hurting. They are on their knees. And if Labour don't have this budget that is there for working people and for those with less, if this budget is a let's make some difficult decisions, as I keep hearing, people will move away from Labour in droves.
And they've already been moving away from Labour.
For them to be Labour.
And if you
be a Labour government.
And you are a major figure in the Labour movement, and you know the Unite and Labour don't always have the best relationship, but you are in the same wider family. Would you think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves can stay in place if this government goes the wrong way, if the budget goes the wrong way, forgive me?
No. I mean, the reality here is that they've got a chance in this budget to rectify what they haven't done in the last 18 months. I mean, we have the debacle of winter fuel, then we have the attacks on disabled people. The reality here is that Labour are supposed to go in, be Labour. We've already had people who have paid, some with their lives, but have paid with austerity over 14 years, with COVID. Where is the Labour government coming in to say, by the way, what's gone on before, we're going to now change that. We're not just going to tinker around the edges. We are here for you. But if people cannot hear that, then I think they will leave Labour.
But Andy, as the non-politician here, Sharon, I know you're not formally a politician, but union leaders are politicians of a certain sort. When you hear Zack Polanski say, basically, we can borrow almost as much as we want in a different way, the markets have got too much power, we shouldn't be in hock to them, as Andy Burnham suggests, is that... Because it might sound appealing to lots of people. Their polling suggests it's really appealing to lots of people. How does it sound to your ears?
It's la-la land economics. Let's be
La-la land.
You know, I'm a man at the Bank of England. I presided over almost £1 trillion of money printing. If that was the route to success and growth, would have long since solved this problem. This is not the time for funny money solutions. We need to invest, and that is the only route, I think, to getting back to growth.
But you do think, Andy, that we should change our fiscal rules and loosen them, don't you? So, of course, that's what we're talking about, that actually the fiscal rules can be loosened to borrow, to invest. Otherwise, we're going to see a situation where oil and gas is gone, we're importing fuel, and we have no industries to replace them, no jobs to replace them. So that's what you do have to borrow to invest.
Final word, Jeremy.
A very final word. The average family is paying £4,000 a year in tax just to pay our debt interest.
And a lot of them are doing that because your party ran up enormous debts ran record taxes.
And I don't apologise for the support we gave families during the pandemic. But my point is, if you don't take measure to control debt, then ordinary families pay more in tax. It's as simple as that. That is actually, by the way, Labour being Labour, and we need less of it, not more of it.
Borrow to invest. It's always a good thing.
Well, the good news for everybody watching is that after this programme, you three are going to carry on the debate on newscast, but we'll talk about that later on because you've all got really interesting things to say and a jolly good, vigorous debate, which is what we like in the studio. Now, Labour still points the finger for much of the economic mess at its Conservative predecessors. The shadow chancellor, Mel Stride, is in charge of trying to salvage the party's economic reputation when it comes to spending our money. But he and his leader are very cross, like Andy Haldane, about the budget warm-up, the weeks of briefings and leaks. So Stride has written to the Treasury's top civil servant this morning asking for answers about, frankly, why it has gone on for weeks and weeks. Not that the Conservatives, of course, ever leaked or briefs any bits of their budgets in advance. That never happened, of course. Not quite the case. Mel Stride, good to have you with us this morning. Let's just start with some questions of principle before we dive into all of this. Is the government too big?
Yes, government is too large in this country. The civil service, for example, has grown by 37% since 2016, and we need to get that under control as part of a wider approach to slimming down and controlling spending so that we can get taxes down instead of them going up and weighing down on growth as a consequence.
And
that's
yes
at the
or
heart
no,
of this.
are taxes too high?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
And did you get the balance between those two things wrong last time?
Well, as I think Jeremy just said, and he's right to say it, we had particular external shocks to our economy. So COVID shrank our economy by over 10% overnight, and we stepped in and protected millions of jobs and livelihoods up and down the country. Nobody at the time was saying we should spend less. Most people were saying we should spend more. And of course, we then had a lot of imported inflation because of the Ukraine-Russia war, and we had to get on top of that. Mm-hmm. And that came with a price, and that had an implication fiscally, including around taxation. But make no mistake, the big choice at this budget now is does the Chancellor have the backbone to control government spending, particularly in the area of welfare, where some of those costs are spiralling out of control, take those tough choices and therefore not have to start putting up taxes again in areas that are going to damage the economy.
It sounds very much like, though, the government is going to get rid of the limits on bigger families claiming benefits known as the two-child benefit cap. Would you vote against that?
Yes, we believe that that cap is there for a good reason. It's a matter of fairness, I think, that if people want to have larger families and those that are not on benefits have to take tough choices around that, can they afford that decision or not?
So you're telling people to have fewer children?
Well, I think it's important that we have fairness in the system, and there are benefits there for up to 2 children. But if you want a much larger family, then I think individual responsibility should come into play in those decisions. And the other thing is that, of course, what we want actually in terms of people coming out of poverty is to have people going into work and therefore working their way out of poverty, which is what happened under the last Conservative government. We saw 200,000 fewer children in absolute poverty.
But why
after
should
housing
children
costs.
be penalised because they are in a bigger family? That's not anything to do with children themselves. And the result of objecting to that policy and not bringing it back is that the children in a bigger family live in households where there might be less cash around through no fault of their own.
As I say, we've had the two-child benefit cap for some time. We took the approach when we were in government to generate an economy that generated jobs, 4 million more jobs as a result of the last Conservative government. And that saw a substantial fall through time from 2010 for that following decade of hundreds of thousands of children coming out of poverty as a consequence. That is the best route to achieving that, not just upping the benefits bill.
So it's clear where your position is on that. In terms of what else you would want to do if you do get back into power next time, you are specifically saying you'd save £23 billion changing the rules on welfare, but welfare spending went up when you were in charge. You're also specifically saying you'd save £8 billion on the civil service, which also grew on your watch. So what's the most convincing argument you can give our viewers why it would be any different next time round?
Well, I think we had demonstrated on the welfare point when we were in office that we were beginning to arrest that rise. So I took through welfare reforms to the work capability assessment, those going on to longer-term sickness and health benefits, which the OBR themselves scored as showing getting on for 500,000 fewer people going on to those benefits. The problem is, one of the first things that this government did was to scrap that, then come forward with their own botched reforms, which they failed to get through their backbenchers. And that's why they're not in a position to grip this issue.
But that was acting almost at the tail end of a very long and chaotic period in government when welfare spending over time had gone up. So again, what is the most convincing argument that you could make to people that it'd be any different next time around?
Well, as I say, Laura, judge me by what I did when I was Secretary of State at Work and Pensions, which was to take through changes that would have seen almost 500,000 fewer people going on to those longer-term benefits. We'd also gone through a consultation on personal independence payments that was interrupted by the general election, but that would have led to further savings in an area where growth has been very high. What does this government do? It's got the TIMS review into personal independence payments, and it's made it very clear in the terms of reference for that review that they will stick to the OBR's numbers. In other words, they will accept that welfare will continue to go up. It's not fair that very hard-working taxpayers who get up early in the morning, go out and work, do the right thing, end up paying for these additional benefits, which are actually themselves a drag on the economy.
Well, it's always worth remembering that most people who claim benefits are in households who work. That's a big part of the debate here. But the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibilities, the independent forecaster, they're also, like you, going to have a very busy few days. Mel Stride, thanks very much indeed for coming in to speak to us this morning. Now, governments have big responsibilities to us all when it comes to looking after the country's money. But they have duties to every citizen when it comes to their safety around the world too. When Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was taken hostage in Iran, it fell to her husband, Richard, to campaign and campaign and campaign for years before she was freed. The story of his frustration with the government and their nightmare as a family is brought to life in a drama that starts on BBC One tonight. The real-life Richard stopped by yesterday, along with the drama Richard, the actor Joseph Fiennes, who plays him in the TV version of this heart-rending story that begins with Nazanin's arrest.
شما نازنین زاغری هستی؟
بله.
بچه‌تونه؟
بله.
بچه میتونه همینجا پیش مادرتون بمونه. شما بفرمایید با من.
Welcome to both of you. It's good to have you with us. Richard, you were on everyone's screens regularly while your family went through this nightmare. But what made you want to tell your story and relive it in a way through a drama?
I think part of it I wanted to share the story, Nazanin wanted to share the story. It felt like we got to see a lot of things that an ordinary family doesn't get to see normally. Got to see behind parts of government, we got to see behind parts of the Iranian system that I had literally no idea that, you know, other governments took hostages, and there was a lot of smoke and mirrors in our story, lots of you know, things said that weren't true, and so that kind of making sense of what we knew at the time and afterwards was important emotionally.
And at the beginning of the first episode, Joseph, there is this just terrible, almost sort of suffocating sense of uncertainty with the family. Nazanin doesn't know what's happening. You don't know what's happening at the end of some phone calls in London. How do you go about playing a character who's not just a real-life person sitting next to you today, which must feel a bit strange, yes, but with the responsibility of telling a story that was so powerful?
Yeah, well, it's a huge responsibility, but I hope that the drama, and you know, a drama by virtue of a camera and a lens and an edit, becomes an adaptation of events, but hopefully that adaptation remains honest, truthful, authentic, and also allows the viewer to participate in a drama behind the closed doors. There's a lot of Richard talking on the front line and being in the press and on the news. She will have enjoyed questioning and suffered torture of some kind. But what's he doing when the doors are shut? What are the conversations there? And that's where the drama explores their story. And I honestly, I found it when I first read the screenplay, as a father of two children, and you get to a certain age as a dad, and you become very emotionally vulnerable. I don't know where it comes from, but as an actor, sometimes that's good and not good. But I responded viscerally to the emotion of the story of Richard and Nazanin's plight here.
Does he do a good job of being you?
Yeah, I mean,
taxi.
It's a funny thing. I think there's things I don't think I noticed in my story until I saw it sort of played back across the drama. I mean, there's a character arc. You know, there's someone that starts off bewildered, confused, frightened, same as what's happening in Iran, then gradually gets more of an understanding and goes angry. And then it gradually going from, instead of being angry, but channeling that and to try and mobilise, how can we push the government?
In terms of the story, there's also the physical transformation of Richard, you know, from the beginning, and you're, you know, a dad and a young family and a big, you know, job, and you're going around in your suit, and then as the years progress, you're then a campaigner on hunger strike. For you portraying the role, how much of it is about that physical transformation?
Well, it's physical, emotional and mental. You know, one could say you're a product of, like I am, of our establishment, and then you think that establishment, democratic establishment, has your back, and then through a series of roadblocks, it would appear that you're shut down and silenced continually, and it's interesting to get to that final point of yelling against it, railing against it. You end up, you know, taking 21 days not eating food and saying, sorry, enough's enough.
And how was that for you, Richard, that process where you see in the drama, and people know this is what happened, that your faith was eroded over time, and your sort of bewilderment becomes disbelief, and then it becomes anger and frustration, and actually, by chance, Jeremy Hunt, who was one of the many ministers that you dealt with, is with us on the programme this weekend. What would you, I suppose, how do you reflect on that now? What would you say to the ministers who tried to shut you out at the beginning.
Oh, well, I think Jeremy Hunt in particular played a really important role because he was probably the first time I felt believed. It felt at the beginning like I was talking to a wall, but Jeremy Hunt was the first minister that just listened, said, OK, I think this is wrong. I think the job of government is to protect people, and I'm going to do what I can. And that was transformative.
There were the real bungled moments. I mean, Boris Johnson famously in 2017 said that Nazanin had been simply teaching people journalism. Now, to a British ear, that sounds completely harmless. To an Iranian ear, that put her in danger. Has he ever reached out to you or apologised to you?
So it was certainly used by the Iranians to justify what they were doing and right up until the very end. And even on Nazanin's last day, she still got her interrogators saying, well, you know, your foreign secretary or prime minister at that point, he confessed the truth. When Nazanin finally met Boris, and he invited us to Downing Street, which was gracious of him. But he didn't apologise. And it was important for her to say, this is what I went through in the wake of your words.
And he didn't, even when she told him that?
No.
Joseph, what was the most striking thing to you about playing Richard?
I think the whole community that surrounded Richard's family and Nazanin's family, for me, was striking. And I love the sense of hope in all of this. And I guess that's a chapter at the last episode we get rewarded with. Of course, there are people out there who are under similar circumstances that are not living in the same hope.
And of course, Nazanin did come home. Your hope did pay off in the end. Gabriella, your daughter, that everyone's seen the gorgeous pictures of her over the years, and I think she's, what, now 11?
Now 11, yeah.
11. And it's a couple of years, I think 3 years now since you've been back, but how hard's it been getting back to anything like a normal life? Has anything surprised you?
It was a lot nicer the past 3 years than the 6 before, just to be clear. Yeah, but I mean, it's right. All the time I was campaigning, I kind of was looking forward to getting back to normal and to pushing a pushchair down the high street and the things that we were doing before. And of course, the water under the bridge has passed. Nazanin's older, I'm older, Gabriella's older, visibly. Sassier and all the things that, you know, when you're 11, you've got a clarity of the world that you know, and a good pushback to parental failings. But I think there is it's nice and it's rare. Like we get a second chance at life.
And Joseph, just finally, you have portrayed real life figures before, and a lot of people will know that you were playing Gareth Southgate. You've played him before in the stage play Dear England, and you're playing him soon in the TV drama. And people know you had the waistcoat and the half-zip jumpers and the immaculately clipped beard. Is there pressure when you're playing people who a lot of people might think they're sort of real life hero?
Yeah, there is a pressure, but hopefully it goes beyond the character. Of course, one wants to honour the people you're portraying in the most authentic way, but often they're a vehicle to understanding, I don't know, bigger pictures, geopolitics in this case, and in Gareth's case, the psyche of a country through football.
And more of the waistcoats and the half-zip jumpers?
Well, I'd much welcome that than I would Fred Waterford. So it's really nice to play good people.
Joseph and Richard, thank you so much for coming in. It's been great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And Prisoner 951's on iPlayer now. So you can watch it from 10 o'clock onwards, but not right now. And it's on BBC One at 9 o'clock tonight, and it is a stunning watch. Jeremy Hunt, it's a complete coincidence you're here on the same day that Richard Radcliffe was telling us about your relationship with him in the Foreign Office. And you went to Tehran, and you didn't manage to see Nazanin, but you did see Gabriella, her daughter, and I think her parents. Just what was that like?
Well, I have to say, first of all, Richard and Nazanin are two of the bravest people I think I've ever met in my whole time in politics. And that moment where you showed a picture of, I went to Tehran to try and negotiate Nazanin's release. I was the mighty Foreign Secretary. And there in the British ambassador's residence, I met Gabriella. And, my eyes welled up. I mean, there was a girl the same age as my own daughter who was having to put up with her mum in prison. Absolutely horrific. And I think, Richard was so brave to keep going because the Foreign Office initially told him to keep quiet, and he ignored that advice, knowing that he was taking a big risk, actually, with Nazanin's future, but he did not want anyone to forget that his wife was in prison, and I think that was incredible.
But it was a bit more than the Foreign Office just saying, keep quiet and we'll work on it. I mean, they actively said, stay away, and they told you he was a troublemaker, didn't they?
They didn't want me to meet him. They thought that he was a troublemaker. But, in fairness, when I said, look, getting Nazanin home has to be our top priority. If we believe in individual freedoms in this country, then when one of our citizens is unjustly imprisoned, then we have to be there for them. And then the Foreign Office really did get behind it. But, in truth, it did take too long, and we do need to reflect on that.
Just as a former Foreign Secretary, also you're here on a day when European allies are trying to continue to support Ukraine. The deal that Donald Trump has put forward, is that even remotely acceptable in your view for President Zelensky?
No. Donald Trump says that Zelensky doesn't hold the cards, but actually he's the one that's taken the cards out of Zelensky's hand. And I think it's a terrible deal. It makes Ukraine weaker. It makes the prospect of another conflict greater if it's imposed on Ukraine. But it's also a big moment of choice for Keir Starmer. I mean, we've discussed this morning, he's had a pretty awful year. But this is probably the decision that history will remember him for the most. And what we need from European leaders now, as Matthew Said writes in the Sunday Times this morning, actually, is not just wringing of hands and words. We need support for Ukraine in terms of weapons and money that shows Putin that Russia cannot win this war.
But there's huge pressure on money, isn't there, Sharon? I mean, do you think the Chancellor should announce more money for defence? There's a long-term promise of a lot more money for defence, but we want no idea where that's going to come from.
Well, look, I mean, I think, and I agree with Jeremy on the points that he's raised there about Ukraine, but also, when you look at what's happened and how Trump has sort of aligned himself with Putin, there are decisions that need to be made now in Britain around us buying British Typhoons, for example, that there is dither and there is delay. We need to be self-sustaining as far as defence is concerned, and we need to make the right decisions now, and that means buy British defence, and we are still waiting for that to come across the table, and that is wrong. We've got the money there, buy British defence for national security, but also for 26,000 workers who rely on those jobs.
And Andy, if the government keeps its longer-term promises on defence spending, how significant a change is that actually to the whole shape of the economy?
Well, if we end up aspiring to the NATO 5%, that's a significant further investment. And I think the key then, Laura, is to turn that necessity into a virtue, to use it as a fulcrum for growth and jobs in all four corners of the UK. And that is the way you make the best of this very bad job.
So many pressures, so many dilemmas, maybe so many opportunities too. It's been great to have you three with us here for the last hour. It's been great also to hear from you. Here are some of your emails. Alistair's gotten in touch about the two-child benefit cap, saying, surely if families can't afford children, why should the rest of the population subsidise them? On the budget more broadly, Trevor tells us if you hit people's savings, pensions and the middle classes, you can wave goodbye to growth. And on Zack Polanski's interview, Brian tells us it's about time the prevailing discourse about the economy was turned on its head. Interesting conversations to come. Thank you to my team at the desk, Jeremy, Sharon and Andy. And in this special week with the budget days away, all three of them will join me and Paddy O'Connell, who we might be able to give a wave to. There he is now. To go, he was paying attention. And we'll continue our conversation about the budget. That will be on Sunday's newscast on BBC Sounds a bit later on this morning. And of course, in the next couple of days, our colleagues across the BBC will have everything you need to know about Rachel Reeves' budget, including coverage live as she gives it in Parliament, as she prepares to announce and explain a whole set of decisions that could save, perhaps, or sink the fortunes of the economy and the prospects of the government. Quite a task. Rachel Reeves herself will be here next Sunday to answer mine and your questions about what she has to say. So stick it in the diary, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place.